Bighorn Foothills, Wyoming Territory, August 1882. The wind in this country was not a weather event. It was a geological force. It sculpted the rock, stunted the trees, and scoured the patience from the men who tried to settle the land. And on a small plot of land nestled against a granite upthrust, Lukas Haldimann was doing something that made no sense at all. He wasn't building on the flat, open ground. He wasn't even building near the rock for shelter. He was building inside it. A narrow vertical fissure, barely 3 feet wide at its mouth and tapering to nothing some 40 feet back, split the granite face. It was a place a man might hide from a sudden squall, or a place a cougar might make its den. It was not a place to build a home. Yet day after day, Lukas was meticulously fitting hand-hewn timbers into this stone slot, wedging a cabin into the earth's own crack. The other settlers thought him mad. Joel Merritt, the settlement's most respected carpenter, stood with his arms crossed, a look of professional pity on his face. He had built a dozen sound structures in the valley, all of them sensible boxes set on stone footings, braced and chinked against the coming winter. He watched Lukas scribe a log to the uneven contours of the rock face, a painstaking process of shaving slivers of wood until the fit was perfect. "You're building your own tomb, Haldimann," Merritt said, his voice loud enough for the others, Silas Croft and Ben Carter, to hear. "What happens when that rock shifts in the first big freeze? It'll crush this box like an egg. And the sun? Man, you'll get maybe an hour of light a day in the winter. It'll be a cold, dark grave." Silas Croft, a farmer whose hands were thick with the work of clearing stones from his own fields, shook his head. "It's a fool's work. The man's building a coffin and plans to live in it. It's the damnedest thing I've ever seen." Lukas Haldimann paused, wiping a line of sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. He looked at the concerned, mocking faces of his neighbors. He was a quiet man, with eyes accustomed to measuring distance and stress in stone, not in the opinions of others. He glanced at the perfect, seamless joint he had just made between wood and rock. He looked back at Merritt. "The rock does not shift," he said, his Swiss accent thickening the simple words. Then he turned back to his work, lifting his adze to shape the next timber. The mockery lasted all through the late summer and into the autumn. The validation would last a lifetime. What did this Swiss alpine mason, a man who thought in terms of pressure and stillness, understand about the physics of convection that a lifetime of frontier carpentry had missed? This story is about more than just a strange cabin. It's a lesson in how the oldest forms of wisdom can solve the most brutal problems. I promise that by the end of this, you will understand the relentless power of wind on a structure and why sometimes the most brilliant solution is not to build a stronger wall, but to find a place where no wall is needed. If you appreciate stories of quiet genius and hard-won survival, consider subscribing to this channel and let us know in the comments. What's the most unconventional but effective solution you've ever seen to a common problem? Lukas Haldimann was not a carpenter. He had never framed a barn, never shingled a roof in the American style. He was not a farmer, unversed in the rhythms of soil and seed. He was a mason, and his trade was an ancient conversation with mountains. He had spent his youth in the Bernese Alps of Switzerland, where buildings didn't stand on the land so much as they grew from it. His hands knew the heft of granite, the grain of limestone, the precise way a dry stacked stone wall could breathe yet hold back a dozen feet of snow. He had worked on high-altitude shelters, hospice chapels, and avalanche barriers. The tools of his mind were the plumb bob, the level, and an innate understanding of thermal mass, wind shear, and the immense insulating power of stillness. He had come to Wyoming with his wife, Anya, and their 2 small children, Emil and Sophie, for the promise of land. The pamphlets had shown green valleys and opportunity, They had not shown the wind. Their first winter, in 1881, was the education. They had built a small, conventional cabin just as Joel Merritt had advised. A single room, 16 by 20 feet, with a loft for the children. They had chinked it with mud and grass, stacked cords of cottonwood, and believed they were prepared. They were not. That winter descended not as a gentle blanket of snow, but as a physical assault. The wind was a predator. It found every microscopic crack in the chinking and forced a blade of cold air through. At night, lying beside Anya under a mountain of blankets and buffalo robes, Lukas could hear the nails in the roof sheathing, groaning under the strain. A high-pitched creak as the wood and metal contracted at different rates in the abyssal cold. Some mornings they would wake to find the inside of their own door iced shut, the moisture from their breath having frozen it solid to the jamb. They had to use a kettle of hot water to melt their way out of their own home. Worst of all was the air itself. Inside the cabin, a space meant to be a sanctuary, their breath smoked. Little plumes of white vapor puffed from Emil and Sophie as they huddled near the small iron stove, a stove that devoured wood at an astonishing rate yet seemed to produce no meaningful warmth beyond a 3-foot radius. Anya's hands were cracked and raw from the cold and the endless work. Lukas felt a kind of failure that was new to him. He had built structures that could withstand the crushing weight of an alpine avalanche, yet he could not keep his own children warm in a simple wooden box. The problem, he realized, wasn't the cold. The cold was a constant. The problem was the wind. The wind was the thief that stole the heat as fast as he could generate it. That spring, as the valley thawed and the other settlers repaired their wind-battered roofs and re-chinked their walls, Lukas Haldimann walked. He did not look at the good timber or the fertile soil. He looked at the rock formations. He spent weeks observing the way the wind flowed over the landscape like water in a riverbed. He watched it shear over the tops of ridges and form eddies behind outcroppings. He was searching not for a place to build, but for a place of calm. And then he found it, the narrow, deep fissure in the granite face. He stood at its mouth during a gale and felt the roaring wind drop to a mere whisper just a few feet inside. The air in the crevice was almost perfectly still. He had found his site. This time he would not build like an American carpenter. He would build like a Swiss mason. He would build for the wind. The failure of a standard frontier cabin in the high plains of Wyoming was not a failure of materials. The logs were thick. The stone for the footings was solid. The failure was one of physics, a fundamental misunderstanding of the primary way a house dies in the winter. The enemy was convection. Heat moves in 3 ways: conduction, radiation, and convection. Conduction is heat transfer through direct contact, the warmth of the stove moving into the iron poker. Radiation is heat transfer through electromagnetic waves, the warmth you feel on your face from a distant fire. But convection is heat transfer through the movement of a fluid, in this case, air. And in Wyoming, the air was never still. A conventional cabin, like Joel Merritt's or Ben Carter's, sat exposed on all 4 sides. The stove inside would heat the interior air. That heat would conduct through the logs, warming the exterior surface of the wall. In a calm environment, a thin layer of warmer air, called a boundary layer, would form on that exterior surface, acting as a slight insulator. But the Wyoming wind never allowed that boundary layer to form. It was a relentless river of cold, dense air flowing at 30, 40, sometimes 60 miles per hour. As this river of air washed over the cabin walls, it scoured that precious heat away instantly. It was like trying to stay warm while standing in a cold river. The heat loss was catastrophic. To combat this, settlers burned prodigious amounts of fuel, A family like the Abernathys might burn through 10 cords of wood in a single winter, a small forest worth of fuel, just to keep the inside of their home from freezing. It was a battle of brute force. Shovel more wood into the fire, and for a few minutes the radiant heat would win. But the moment the fire died down, the convective heat loss would reclaim the space, the temperature plunging back toward misery. The second part of the convective failure was air infiltration. No matter how well a man chinked his logs, a log cabin is composed of hundreds of linear feet of seams. Under the immense pressure of the wind, cold air would knife through any crack it could find. It would pour in around window frames, under doors, and straight through the walls. This created drafts that were not just uncomfortable, but dangerous. A candle flame would flicker and dance, not from a draft within the room, but from the house itself breathing the gale. You could feel the air moving across the floor. This constant influx of frigid air meant that you weren't just heating a static volume of space. You were attempting to heat the entire state of Wyoming as it passed through your living room. The task was impossible. The settlers were living inside poorly sealed containers, fighting a losing war against the second law of thermodynamics. And the wind was the enemy's commanding general. Lukas Haldimann had watched this battle and decided not to fight. He would refuse to show up on the battlefield. The construction of the Crevice cabin was an act of surgical precision. Lukas began not by laying a foundation, but by preparing the rock itself. With a mason's hammer and a set of chisels, he spent weeks smoothing the two parallel faces of the crevice. He wasn't trying to make them perfectly flat, but to remove any sharp protrusions or loose flakes that could create pressure points against his timbers. This was the work Merritt and the others mistook for foolishness. They saw a man chipping away at a mountain when he should have been raising walls. They didn't understand he was preparing his true foundation. He built the cabin's side walls first, but not on the ground. He built them in place, timber by timber, scribing each log to the unique, undulating surface of the granite. This was a technique unknown to frontier carpentry. A standard cabin is built of uniform logs, the gaps filled with chinking. Lukas was creating a chinkless seal. He would lay a log in place, its raw surface inches from the stone. Then, using a small compass-like tool, he would trace the rock's profile onto the log. With painstaking care, using a draw knife and an adze, he would carve away the wood until the log nested against the stone, as if it had grown there. The process was incredibly slow. A single log could take a full day. Joel Merritt would stop by, shaking his head. "You're wasting the best building months, Haldimann. You'll have snow on you before you get a roof up. Just build a straight wall and chink it. It's how it's done." Lukas would only nod, not bothering to explain that a seam of chinking was a seam for the wind. His seams were solid wood against solid rock. The cabin was only 10 feet wide on the inside, constrained by the crevice, but it was 30 feet deep. The two long walls were the living rock of Wyoming. The front and back walls were his timber work. He built the back wall solid, scribing it into the tapering end of the fissure until it was a solid plug of wood and stone. The only exposed face was the front, which housed a single, stout door and two small, well-sealed windows. He built a steep pitched roof, but he didn't stop at the cabin walls. He extended the rafters and sheathing until they were flush with the outer face of the granite cliff. The effect was startling. From a distance, you didn't see a cabin at all. You saw a rock face with a wooden door set into it, as if leading to a mine. His wife, Anya, watched with a mixture of apprehension and unwavering faith. One afternoon, she brought him a pail of water and stood looking at the half-finished structure, a perfect wooden rectangle pressed deep into the stone. "It looks like a ship in a bottle, Lukas," she said, her voice quiet. He smiled, a rare sight. "A ship in a harbor, Anja. a ship in a harbor. The space between his wooden walls and the rock was tight, no more than an inch or two in most places. He didn't fill this gap. This was the most crucial part of the design. Merritt saw it as wasted space, a place for moisture and vermin to collect. Lukas saw it as his most important building material, trapped, unmoving air. He was building a house inside an even bigger house made of granite, and the insulation between them was a cushion of stillness. When he was done, just as the first flurries of snow began to drift down from the bighorns, the structure was complete. It was less a cabin and more a meticulously crafted plug, sealing the mouth of a stone passage. It had cost him a full season of labor, earned him the reputation of a madman, and used half the timber of a conventional build. It was now ready for the test. To understand the genius of Lukas Haldimann's design, you have to understand the physics of what he was fighting. The primary weapon of winter is convection, the transfer of heat by the movement of air. Think of a bowl of hot soup. If you let it sit in a still room, it cools slowly. A boundary layer of warm, humid air forms over the surface, acting like an invisible lid, slowing the escape of heat. But if you blow on that soup, you are using convection to rapidly accelerate the cooling. You are stripping away that protective boundary layer, allowing the heat to escape much faster. A conventional frontier cabin is the bowl of soup. The Wyoming wind is the constant, relentless breath blowing upon it. Every square foot of exposed wall is a surface from which heat is being violently stolen. A typical log wall, even a thick one, might have an R value, a measure of its resistance to heat flow of around 8 or 10, but that value assumes still air. In a 40-mile-per-hour wind, the effective R value plummets. The wind acts as a powerful heat sink, constantly pulling BTUs, British thermal units, a measure of heat energy, out of the wood. The stove inside has to work not just to heat the cabin's air, but to replace the thousands of BTUs being stripped from the walls every minute. Lukas Haldimann's Crevice cabin defeated this process in two profound ways. First, and most obviously, he eliminated 2 of the 4 exposed walls. The east and west walls of his cabin were not wood. They were hundreds of feet of solid granite. The wind could howl against the Bighorn foothills for a century, and it would not remove a single BTU from the interior of that rock. He had simply borrowed the mountain for his walls. But the truly brilliant part of the design was how he handled the other 2 walls. The back wall was plugged deep into the fissure, where the wind could not reach it. That left only one surface exposed to the storm, the 10-foot-wide front face. He had reduced his cabin's vulnerable surface area by nearly 90%, but he didn't stop there. The narrow gap he had left between his wooden side walls and the granite face of the crevice was the master stroke. This column of air, sealed at the top by the roof and at the back by the rear wall, could not move. It was dead air, and dead air is one of the most effective insulators on the planet. A 1-inch gap of still air has an R value of approximately 1. This doesn't sound like much, but Lukas had created an R1 insulating blanket that wrapped around the 2 longest sides of his home. More importantly, this dead airspace completely decoupled the inner wooden wall from the relentless convective force of the wind. The wind could no longer touch his primary living envelope. It could only touch the mountain. He had effectively created a thermos. The outer wall was the granite crevice. The inner wall was his wooden cabin. The insulation between them was a vacuum of movement, a pocket of profound stillness. He wasn't just blocking the wind. He was nullifying the very principle by which the wind steals heat. He had created a small, man-made zone of atmospheric calm, a place where the rules of the Wyoming winter no longer applied. While his neighbors were burning forests to fight the gale, Lukas was planning to heat his home with a small stove and the captured warmth of his own family. That January, the blizzard came. It was not a storm of heavy, wet flakes, but a ground blizzard, the plains' most vicious weapon. For 14 days, the wind never dropped below 50 miles per hour, picking up the dry powder snow from the ground and blasting it horizontally across the landscape. It was less a snowfall and more a river of airborne ice, flowing with the force of a sand blaster. Visibility dropped to 0. The temperature hovered at 20 below, but with the wind, the chill factor was a lethal 70 below 0. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a state of siege. The Abernathy family, with 3 young children, found their woodpile, which they thought would last the month, dwindling at an alarming rate. After 5 days, Mr. Abernathy had to risk the blinding storm to get to his lean-to, only to find the remaining wood buried under a 6-foot drift that was packed as hard as concrete. It took him half a day of frantic digging to retrieve a few logs. Inside, they huddled in a single room, wearing every layer of clothing they owned, the stove glowing red but the corners of the room thick with frost. At Joel Merritt's place, the wind was a constant, deafening roar. It was a physical presence, shaking the very timbers of the house he had built with his own expert hands. Fine. Dust like snow forced its way through every crack, piling in ghostly white lines on the floorboards beneath the windows. He kept the fire roaring, but if he stood more than 5 feet away, the cold bit at him. His water bucket, kept by the door, was a solid block of ice. Inside the Haldimann cabin, there was quiet. The sound of the hurricane-force winds outside was a distant, muted hum, like the sound of a faraway waterfall. The air inside was perfectly still. Anya sat at the small wooden table, mending one of Emil's shirts. Her fingers were nimble, not stiff with cold. She needed only the light from a single kerosene lamp. The children, Emil and Sophie, were not huddled by the stove. They were on a rug in the middle of the floor, quietly playing with a set of carved wooden animals. Lukas sat in a chair, oiling a piece of harness leather. The small stove glowed with a gentle, steady heat, consuming wood at a slow, almost lazy pace. A pot of stew simmered on its surface, its gentle steam fogging the lower corner of a window pane that was cool to the touch but had no frost on it. The temperature inside their home was a steady, comfortable 65 degrees. They were not surviving the storm, they were simply living, while the storm raged, forgotten, a few inches away on the other side of the rock. They were burning less than a quarter of the wood of their neighbors, yet they were living in a different season. The vindication came on the 10th day of the blizzard, born of Joel Merritt's desperation. A gust of wind, stronger than the rest, had finally ripped the heavy canvas tarp from his outdoor workbench, exposing his precious tools to the full fury of the storm. His saws, planes, chisels, and braces were his livelihood, and he could not bear the thought of them being ruined, encased in ice and blasted by snow. His own shed was frozen and drifted in. He had nowhere to put them. Then he remembered Haldimann's strange construction. He remembered the uncanny stillness at the mouth of the crevice. Cursing himself for a fool but seeing no other choice, he bundled himself against the storm, gathered his most valuable tools into a heavy wooden box, and fought his way through the blinding whiteout to Lukas's place. He didn't dare knock on the door and admit his need. Instead, he wedged his toolbox into the narrow space between the cabin's outer wooden wall and the granite face of the crevice. It was sheltered from the direct wind, at least. It was the best he could do. He plunged back into the storm, returning to his own cold, roaring house to wait. 4 days later, the wind finally broke. A brilliant, painful sun shone on a world transformed, a landscape of sculpted white drifts. Merritt's first thought was for his tools. He went to his own workbench first. The few tools he'd left behind were fused to the wood, buried in a mixture of ice and snow so hard he would need a chisel to free them. His heart sank. He walked over to Haldimann's crevice, dreading what he would find. He rounded the corner of the granite outcrop and stopped. The sight was surreal. A thick, crystalline fur of frost coated the entire rock face, climbing 20 feet into the air. The blizzard had flash-frozen the moisture in the very stone, but the frost did not cover the whole cliff. It stopped in a perfect, razor-sharp vertical line. To the left of the line was frosted rock. To the right of the line was the simple wooden doorframe of Lukas Haldimann's cabin, and on the wood there was no frost. None at all. The air in the crevice, held captive between the cabin and the rock, had been just still enough, just warm enough, to prevent the ice from forming. It was a perfect picture of the physics at work. Merritt reached into the gap to retrieve his toolbox. He braced himself for the biting cold of frozen steel. He expected the metal handles to be welded together with ice, but his hand felt only still, dry air. The metal of his saw was cold, yes, but it was a neutral cold. It wasn't the heat-sucking, dangerous cold of the tools on his own bench. There was no ice on them, a light dusting of powder snow, but no ice. He lifted the saw out, its teeth clean and sharp. He stood there for a long time, looking from the frost line on the rock to the simple door. He finally understood. Lukas hadn't been building a tomb. He had been building a fortress against the wind itself, and his primary material had been the mountain. Merritt walked to the door and knocked. Lukas opened it. A wave of simple, gentle warmth washed over Merritt's face. There was no blast of cold rushing in, no frantic dance of air pressure equalizing, just a calm warmth. Merritt looked past Lukas and saw Anya and the children, comfortable, moving without the stiff, bundled motions of the winterbound. They were living in a small pocket of summer. Merritt was not a man for apologies, but he was a man who respected results. He looked Lukas Haldimann in the eye, the carpenter acknowledging the master mason. "You didn't build a house, Haldimann," Joel Merritt said, his voice full of a new and profound respect. "You built a harbor." The story of the 14-day blizzard and the warm cabin in the rock spread through the Bighorn foothills like a spring thaw. Joel Merritt, once the loudest critic, became the most powerful advocate. A man of his standing admitting he was wrong carried more weight than any argument. He didn't just tell the story, he explained the principle, using his own frozen tools as proof. He described the frost line on the rock, the quiet warmth inside, the sheer, undeniable success of the design. The first to adopt the idea were the men who understood rock best, the crews working the small quarries that supplied the territory with building stone. They were accustomed to working in and around cliffs and ledges. They saw the logic immediately. That spring, several small shelters and line shacks were built using the Haldimann niche principle. Instead of building freestanding sheds that would be blown apart by the next winter's gales, they found or blasted small crevices, fitting their structures tightly inside. The fuel savings were immediate and dramatic. By 1885, more than a dozen such structures had been built in the region, all based on Lukas's simple, powerful idea. The technique became a piece of local folk wisdom, a testament to the quiet Swiss mason who had listened to the wind instead of fighting it. Lukas Haldimann's Crevice cabin was an intuitive application of principles that modern building science would not formalize for another century. His design anticipated the core concepts of earth-sheltered construction and passive house standards. By using the mountain as a thermal mass and a windbreak, and by creating a dead-air insulation space, he had built a super-insulated, high-performance home using only logs and his deep understanding of the natural world. He had, in essence, perfected the building envelope, ensuring that the barrier between the conditioned indoor space and the unconditioned outdoor space was as robust and unbroken as possible. The frontier was a relentless testing ground of ideas. It did not reward credentials or tradition or loud opinions. It rewarded what worked. The settlers of the Bighorn foothills were practical people, and their survival depended on recognizing a better way when they saw one. Most men looked at the Wyoming wind and saw an enemy to be endured, a force to be battled with thicker walls and bigger fires. They built to resist the storm. Lukas Haldimann saw the wind not as an enemy, but as a river to be avoided. He understood a truth deeper than carpentry. You do not win by standing in the middle of the flood and building a stronger dam. You win by finding the high ground, the quiet eddy, the place the current cannot reach. He didn't build a better wall to fight the wind. He simply chose a place where the wind did not exist. The safest wall is the one the wind cannot find. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and survival valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like it. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What modern technologies still rely on the simple, ancient principle of creating a still air gap for insulation? Your engagement helps us continue to bring these forgotten histories to light. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building techniques should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.